everyone, and welcome to Pack 75.
Welcome to Pack 75.
Hi, and welcome to Pack 75.
I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Arts and Humanities here at Manchester Metropolitan University. And it gives me great pleasure to open the Pack 75 Viewing the Past and Looking to the Future celebrations to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the 5th Pan-African Congress held here in Manchester in 1945. Our online programme enables us to connect with audiences around the world, and I am delighted to announce that one of our keynote speakers, Kwame Anthony Appiah, will broadcast his speech live from his home in Princeton, USA. We are proud to be working in association with all three Greater Manchester universities and other institutions, including See My World, Contact Theatre, National Black Arts Alliance, Manchester Centre for Public History and Heritage, and the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Centre. Most importantly, we are pleased that this event has had the full involvement of students from across Manchester's universities, participating in interviews, running a Sunday programme, and being important collaborators in the Pack 75 celebrations. It is particularly special that we are hosting this event in Black History Month with the involvement of our students. They have engaged with passion and enthusiasm and will take the learning from these events to future generations. So, thank you for listening, stay safe, and I hope you enjoy the programme of events that we've curated for you. Thank you, and bye for now.
I'd like to say to viewers, you're going to have a really interesting time watching this. We know it's a very different period than what we had originally planned, but we're really looking forward to what will be an amazing online festival of events.
Hello and welcome to the Pan-African Congress 75th Anniversary celebrations. Thank you for joining us for this session. During this session, we will be having the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen running. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please put them in there. That way we can track them all easily. If you can use the chat just for general chats, that's great. And please note that any hate speech will not be tolerated. We are recording this session and we'll be making it available online on our YouTube channel tomorrow for you to watch again and share with your friends. And so now I would like to introduce Professor Olo Aduku, who will introduce the next session. Thank you.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the second event for today's session in the Pan-African Congress 75th Anniversary celebrations. It really gives me great pleasure again to introduce and invite Dr. Kai Sing Tan from Performance and Art at the MMU University, who will be hosting and chairing the debate. And the debate is being called Viewing the Past and Looking to the Future. Over to you, Kai.
Thank you very much, Ola. So could we have the slide up, please? So how can we view our past, African socio-political histories, and its link with African self-determination and development as a lens with which to view our contemporary post-pandemic future and its relationship to the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now that's why I call it a meaty topic for a proper debate. And in a few strokes, the statements really sweeps across time and geography, but is also very fully situated too, centering as it does in African, or more specifically in Pan-African identities. So the question doesn't just relate the past with present. The murder of George Floyd captured in 8 minutes, 46 seconds on a mobile phone that catalyzed a summer of discontent with solidarity protests worldwide. But it also invites us to imagine a future, a new normal, a better future. And I like to think of this statement as an invitation for us to be creative, to dream big, to be bold, to reimagine how things can be, and especially through arts and creativity. After all, we have those words in red. We have how, so that's already an invitation. And we of course have the next word, lens. So we're using the past as a lens to look at the future. And of course, this motion ends with a question mark. Again, that's a lovely invitation for us to dream. And I think this is also a nice opportunity for us to think about the pan in Pan-Africanism. And pan refers to combining from, it's all inclusive, and especially in relation to the whole of a continent or a racial group or religion, etc. We're also talking about diversity within this, I think, in this kind of pan, this notion of pan. We're extending, I like to invite us to think about allies. I like us to think about working with accomplices. And of course, if we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, it's founded by women, including queer women. And the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 has really shown how it has galvanized people from all walks. So I think the statement really brings to life a point that W.E.B. Du Bois, the American sociologist who organized the first Pan-African Congress in 1919 in Paris, made about what he referred to as the color line being applicable to other non-whites as well, like the Chinese and Japanese, for instance. Today's motion also makes a powerful direct connection to the original statement. And next slide, please. And that's the statement that was shared at the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, 1945. And that statement is entitled, "The Challenge to the Colonial Powers," and I quote, "We are determined to be free. We want education, the right to earn a decent living, the right to express our thoughts and emotions, to adopt and create forms of beauty. Without all this, we die, even if we live. We will fight in every way we can for freedom, democracy, and social betterment." So with the word beauty in there, forms of beauty, we're talking about possibly the power of art. There's also talk of education. And of course, the Pan-African Congress celebrations this week is a tripartite, it's put together by 3 universities. So if we talk about education, we can also talk about higher education specifically. In the picture on the left, you can see the new Arts and Humanities building of Manchester Metropolitan University. And I've added a link over there, and that's the new Pan-African Congress at 75 channel. So please go and have a look, and you can see the installation in its full glory. And of course, this same statement that I've just read out is the statement that we see throughout this festival. And this festival is, of course, called Viewing the Past and Looking to the Future. And this is the 75th anniversary of the 5th Pan-African Congress that happened in Manchester. So this festival is curated by Professor Ola Uduku, who introduced the session. Next slide, please. And that's her on the left. Ola is, of course, a professor of architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture. Her specialisms are in the history of educational architecture in Africa, and she's currently engaged in developing postgraduate research and teaching links in architecture, urbanism, heritage and conservation between West Africa architecture schools and those in Northwest England. Ola has put together 4 days of 16 events, all free of charge, in collaboration with other universities, as I've mentioned. And working closely with her in the past few months, I've observed the very collaborative approach, a very feminist, very diverse approach to leadership, diversified approach to leadership. And also, what's really interesting is how Ola has juxtaposed emerging researchers alongside big name speakers. So that's something that's been quite interesting. And of course, Ola has been the person to come up with the statement that we saw at the beginning, and well, of this the statement for this debate. Also coordinating this event is Beresford Edwards, whom you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. Beresford is a software manager at University of Manchester, and he is the BAME Staff Network co-chair. Beresford has also curated a number of events, including a Sunday session with students and with Lem Sisse, so please look out for that. But I like to think of this kind of juxtaposition. I think this juxtaposition of new emerging leaders with quite established, well-known people. And this morning we had Khadija Diskin, PhD student, with Evaroa Hirsch, which was such an energizing session. I think that again echoes what we saw at the 5th Pan-African Congress, because that was where you had new leaders who then went on to lead countries in Africa. This slide, you can see Ola standing next to Beresford, and that is actually proportionate. Ola is tiny and Beresford is really tall. And my name is Kai, and I'm an artist and curator. I'm a senior lecturer and program leader at the Manchester School of Art. And I'm helping out at the festival, and I'm the chair for this session. So today we have an amazing cast. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk about the format for today. So it is a mixed session. We will have a few videos that we will be sharing. And we will also have a few live sessions. And between the videos and between the sessions, I would like to add a couple of questions or statements just to kind of open things up. And I hope that you would allow me to maybe be a little bit provocative, just to open things up. And my invitation to us also is to tweet, and the hashtag is hashtag PAC75. And of course, PAC is pronounceable, which is really nice and convenient. So it will be an interesting session. So we have a few speakers: Professor Gary Young, Dr. Shireen Hirsch, Elnor Mitha, Rachel Evaroa, and Professor Farida Vis. And we will have responses by Jeff Brown, as well as PhD student Khadija Diskin, who was talking this morning. And this will be followed by a discussion between the panelists. And then we'll also open it up so that everyone will have the opportunity to raise questions or to respond to what's being raised. I don't think we can come to any conclusion, and maybe that's a really good thing. And my invitation is for us to maybe think of today's 2 hours as an opportunity to maybe think of different ideas, to get challenged maybe, and to also for this session to open up further dialogues and further imaginations, perhaps for the next 75 years. So let's get going. But before we do that, I just want to also just acknowledge the team behind the session as well as the PAC 75. And that's the Manchester Metropolitan University team, including Stringer, Aid, Mark, Emily, Rachel, Neil, Lucy, Erica. So thank you for making this possible. So without further ado, we should get going. And first up is Professor Gary Young. And let's have a look at what he has to share today.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to give this short presentation. I want to start in the summer of 1944, as the Nazi occupation of Paris was reduced to just a few desperate crackles of gunfire, and the Allies prepared for the optics of the liberation. But as General de Gaulle planned to walk in triumph down the Champs-Élysées, the Americans identified a serious problem. 2/3 of the Free French forces, which he commanded, comprised of colonial troops, overwhelmingly from Africa. If this were truly going to be a victory for civilization over barbarism, then the visuals were all wrong. The sight of black troops identified with liberating European nation was more than the Americans could bear. In a memo referring to the division that would accompany de Gaulle on liberation, stamped confidential in January 1944, Dwight Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major General Walt Bedell-Smith, wrote, "It is more desirable that the division mentioned above consist of white personnel." He continued, "This would indicate the 2nd Armored Division, which, with only 1/4 native personnel, that's black, is the only French division operationally available that could be made 100% white." The British agreed. "It's unfortunate that the only French formation that is 100% white is an armored division in Morocco," wrote British General Frederick Morgan in a document to Allied Supreme Command. "Every other French division is only about 40% white. I've told Colonel de Chavannes that his chances of getting what he wants will be vastly improved if he can produce a white infantry division." But there was one guy who didn't get the memo. George Duckson from Gabon was 22. His father had fought for the French in the First World War, and George signed up for the Second. He fought with the French, but then was caught by the Germans and put in a prisoner of war camp in 1940, but he escaped 3 years later and joined the resistance and made his way to Paris. In the week preceding the German surrender, he fought tenaciously in street-to-street combat, earning himself the nickname the Lion of the 17th Arrondissement. In the run-up to de Gaulle's victory parade, George Duckson had a bet with his friends that he could get in the papers on the parade himself. And so, there he is, photobombing de Gaulle, appearing just inside the shot. Just inside the shot, you can see him just over de Gaulle's left shoulder there, and then consequently walking down the Champs-Élysées as the French leader's bodyguards desperately try to shove him off the parade, out of the camera's eye and beyond the gaze of history. Over the next 10 minutes, I want to paint a broad picture of the moment in which the Congress took place. And I thought Duckson's antics were a good place to start, since it works in some ways as a contextual metaphor. The African colonial subject who lays down his life for the colonial power, only to find himself marginalized both in the moment and historically, not as the lost object of benign amnesia, but amputated from the record in malign choreography. The war had been sold by the Allied forces as a victory for democracy over totalitarianism and civilization over barbarism. And this is a fiction that endures to this day. For while it was most certainly a defeat for barbarism, It can only be understood as a victory for civilization if you to exclude the majority of humanity and declare them uncivilized and uncivilizable. And those who attended the Congress knew that because they were among the most strident activists of those who did not count. America, France, and Britain controlled large swathes of the world in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, or at home, where in America non-white people were denied their basic rights. At the end of the war, Britain's colonial subjects outnumbered British citizens by 8-1, and France by 2-1. In the US, Black Americans in the South toiled under segregation with no civil rights. Indeed, as the US was charged with the denazification of Germany, forcing Germans to both own up to their war crimes and more generally understand and acknowledge the evil that they had committed in the camps and elsewhere, the Americans were also inflicting strict color bars on their segregated troops and trying those in different courts if they violated them. This irony was not lost on the Germans. On Hermann Goering's second day of direct examination by his defense counsel in Nuremberg, he was asked his definition of Lebensraum. That concept is a very controversial one, he said. I can fully understand that the powers, and I refer only to the 4 signatory powers, who call more than 3/4 of the world their own, explain this concept differently. Speaking a few days later to his psychiatrist, he pointed out that the British Empire had, I quote, not been built up with due regard for principles of humanity, while America had, I quote, hacked its way to a rich Lebensraum by revolution, massacre, and war. Now the aim here, obviously, is not to create a moral parallel between Nazism and colonialism. It's not to take sides between one form of oppression and another, but simply, as the Congress was doing, to take your own side and advocate for it. And this was no abstract point. 9 months after Duckson was shoved on the Champs-Élysées, when the Nazis formally surrendered from the war on May the 5th, 1945, France celebrated with more parades, festooned with flags and merriment. But not everyone felt the liberation applied to them. In Syria and Lebanon, there were major demonstrations against French occupation that day, while in the small towns of Sétif and Guelma in French-occupied Algeria, on that day, demonstrations by the anti-colonial forces were suppressed by the French colonial police. When news reached rural areas, local people attacked and killed around 100 European settlers. On instructions from Paris, the French state unleashed an unwieldy retaliation, including aircraft bombers and the Foreign Legion, which resulted in between 6,000 and 20,000 Algerian dead. In the year to come, the year of the conference, we would begin to see the very first cracks in the edifice of colonialism. Roughly 6 weeks prior to the conference, Ho Chi Minh declared independence from Vietnam. 6 weeks after the conference, Indonesia declared independence from the Netherlands. Some of the leadership class that would lead these countries in the future, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of what would be Ghana, Hastings Banda of what would be Malawi, were at the conference. But others, like Errol Barrow of Barbados or Soweto Sekama of Botswana, were nevertheless in the country. The Congress was, of course, a historical event in itself. Men make their own history, wrote Karl Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, with all apologies to half of the humanity that he left out. But they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. These were some of the salient circumstances in which this history was made. Thank you.
So the war as a fiction of victory for democracy over totalitarianism and civilization over barbarism, which is a fiction that endures today, to this day, because the majority of humanity remain excluded. So that was Professor Gary Young, and of course, we all know Gary Young. He is an award-winning author, broadcaster, and professor of sociology at the University of Manchester. And he is formerly a columnist at The Guardian. As we understand, he's a little bit busy now. He is covering the US elections, so he couldn't join us today. Next up, we have Dr. Shireen Hirsch. So Shireen is a historian based jointly at Manchester Metropolitan University and the People's History Museum. Shireen's research explores race, migration, and the labour movement in modern British history. Shireen talks about her work as being characterized by co-creation. And if you click on the link, or if you follow the link here, you will be able to see an op-ed that she wrote with Ola, as well as Dr. Marie Molloy, which gives us the historical context of the festival. Shireen has written and talked extensively about anti-racism, including about how Enoch Powell's speech has laid the kind of ideological groundwork for the hostile immigration system that we have today. So let us see what Shireen has to say today. So let's play the video.
Hi, and thank you very much for inviting me to contribute today. I want to start this short talk with an introduction to Ras T. McConnell. He was a brilliant figure in Manchester and in world history. He was central to the 5th Pan-African Congress, but he's rarely remembered in our city of Manchester. So McConnell was born in British Guyana, and as he became more involved in the Ethiopian cause following the Italian invasion, he took the name Ras Tafaris McConnell, or Ras T. McConnell. He moved to London in 1937, where he shared a flat with the Pan-African leader George Padmore. And during the war, McConnell left London to avoid conscription. Like many other Pan-Africanists, he refused to fight for the British Empire. So he moved to Manchester, where there were already many black activists, and he moved in with Dr. Peter Milliard, who had a spare room. In Manchester, like in other cities in Britain, there were colour bars that excluded Black and Asian communities from entering spaces. As well as being a Pan-Africanist, McConnell was unusually for a left activist. He was a very successful businessman. And he saw a great economic and political opportunity in these colour bars. There was a need to provide spaces which were open to Black communities in Manchester. So he set up a chain of restaurants all along the top of Oxford Road. And some people knew this as McConnell's Road. There was this included an Ethiopian tea shop, the Orient it was called, a club called the Forum, and a place called Bella Toil. He went on to open a bookshop, and he found a publishing house producing pamphlets in the monthly magazine Pan-Africa. But the most impressive space he opened, and the most successful, was the Cosmopolitan. It was a huge venue that served curries, Chinese food. It was an amazing space that had a mural painted by Jewish refugees that showed the power of anti-colonial struggle. The restaurant itself, the Cosmopolitan, was hugely successful. It attracted Black seafarers, West Indian servicemen, and African workers who were based in Greater Manchester. And it was also popular with Black American GIs from the giant US Air Base at Burton Wood near Warrington. And like all US Armed Forces bases at the time, it was segregated, this base. So the Cosmopolitan provided a space for these American GIs where they could socialize and eat. And they also were able to spend their money at the time. So it was a hugely financially successful place. For a time, Kath Locke, Maasai community activist and co-founder in of the 1970s Black Women's Abasindi Cooperative, worked at the Cosmopolitan. And most surprisingly, Jomo Kenyatta, future leader of Kenya, also managed the restaurant for a time. Kenyatta was a key delegate at the Congress. And when Kenyatta returned to Kenya, he was imprisoned for 7 years by the British colonial system before he went on to become the leader of an independent Kenya. But this is the violence of the British Empire that we must remember. So through the profits of the Cosmopolitan and other venues, McConnell was able to finance the hosting of the fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester. And he was also able to accommodate Black delegates at a time when it would have been very difficult for them to enter hotels in Manchester. McConnell's links to the mayor and the Labour Party also meant the securing of the large town hall, what was called the Chawton upon Medlock Town Hall at the time, and what is now the MMU Arts Building as the venue for the Congress. So McConnell was key to the Pan-African Congress taking place in Manchester. And for him, Manchester was not an irrelevant city within this event. He put it beautifully in this quote that I want to read out here. So he said, looking at our conference and residents in Manchester, you could say that we colour people had a right there because of the age-old connections between cotton, slavery and the building up of cities in England. We also felt that in a way we were remaking history by coming to stir up that other side of Manchester, its fierce anti-slavery streak. So Manchester gave us an important opportunity to express and expose the contradictions, the fallacies and the pretensions that were at the very centre of the empire. McConnell shaped Manchester and world history, yet he's rarely remembered. Just as Manchester's colonial past is hidden with its wealth drawn from cotton and the enslaved, so too is McConnell's work in bringing down the empire. The Congress is part of his legacy that we celebrate today. When we think of Black history in Britain, we think of the Windrush generation, the arrival of the Windrush ship in '48 as a sort of anchor for a wave of successive generations of Black communities in Britain. But these Black people were not simply injected into a homogenous society, and in reality, Black communities had existed prior to 1948 in Britain, and indeed in Manchester. Without these networks, these rich networks of activists, the Pan-African Congress of 1945 would not have taken place here at all. And there were many other key Black activists who lived in Manchester or in Greater Manchester, such as Len Johnson, a Black working class boxer and a communist who went on to organise anti-racist campaigns in Manchester after the Congress. And Len wasn't the only working class delegate there. The Fifth Congress was not just intellectuals primarily talking, but it had workers' representatives there in numbers. Black women were also at the heart of the Congress, women like Amy Ashford Garvey. So these figures are important in our history, yet our school curriculum rarely discusses this past. If Black history is taught in schools, it is often American history that our students are taught. Malcolm and Martin, a distant world that is separate to civilized Britain. So when we talk about decolonising the curriculum, both in our school system and our university system, we must reckon with a British past of racism and colonialism, as well as Black self-organisation. So 75 years on from the Congress, Black Lives Matter has re-emerged as a movement that attempts to challenge the structural racism that dominates our society. The symbolic high point of this year has been the dismantling of the Colston statue in Bristol, but it's also spread out into all aspects of our lives. At MMU, many staff and students have begun to organise and push for a different way of running our university and to challenge structural racism in our working lives. And in response to the national Black Lives Matter movement here, we've heard opposing arguments that the movement needs to be patient, that there is a longer, more patient constitutional way of doing things. If only those who had pulled down the statue had gone through the council and waited another decade, etc., etc. Similar arguments were made towards the delegates at the Pan-African Congress. So a journalist from the Picture Post, one of the key reporters of the Congress, with some brilliant photographs I'd recommend people checking of the Congress, but the reporter reported on the Congress in the most patronising tone. They commented that the delegates were extremists, and the arguments of colonialism were actually much more nuanced, good and bad, etc. One of the key delegates picked out by this condescending journalist was Joseph Appiah. He was a delegate from the West African Student Union, and we'll be hearing from his son, the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, later today as the keynote to this weekend. So Joseph Appiah is quoted by the journalist as saying, "The only language the Englishman understands is force." The Pitch Post journalist patronisingly commented that this hothead delegate of the Congress had extremist views. You don't get a sense from these media reports of the exhilaration and sense of freedom that Black people must have felt meeting and organising in Manchester, walking into the town hall for this Congress with the flags of Black independent nations on display. There must have been a feeling of pride and determination to continue the struggle in Africa against colonial rule and in imposing the colour bar in Britain. The delegates at the Congress were not afraid of in holding back their politics, and they tied anti-colonialism to a socialist politics. They did not retreat from those who attacked them as extremist. They invited the socialist activist and ILP leader John McNair to give the welcome speech at this Congress in Manchester. This speech by McNair was an anti-capitalist speech, and thanks to Robbie Shilliam for transcribing his speech. You can find the full transcript online, and on Marxist.org you can find many of the transcripts from the Congress itself. McNair's politics showed the importance of connecting trade union and working class struggle with anti-racism and anti-colonialism. He argued they could not be separate but must be woven together. So McNair ends his speech to the Congress quoting George Padmore, who is the key Pan-Africanist movement for this Congress. McNair says, "When George was replying to the North African workers at a conference in 1937, he told us then that the British colossus of capitalism and imperialism was standing with one foot on the bodies of the white workers and the other foot on the bodies of the Black workers. And George said it was the duty of white and Black workers to remember they were workers and that mighty heave which would bring down the colossus and break it." So now, at 75 years on, at a time when capitalism is failing us on so many levels, with rising racism, a pandemic that is impacting on Black and Asian people disproportionately, when the worth of all of our lives is being measured in violent economic terms, we can draw inspirations from those who met in Manchester in 1945 and their agency. They refused to simply wait for enlightened leaders or to hope that the British Empire would lose control from above and that another empire would take its place. They organised and pushed for a different reality. And I'll leave the last words to Mr. Richardson, who is quoted by a journalist as a delegate of the Congress. He had lived in England for 45 years and explained to the reporter that he intended to stay to help civilise the English people. We remain indebted for such actions, and I think the best way we can honour their work is to continue the struggle today. So thank you very much.
What a rousing call for action by Dr. Shireen Hirsch, the refusal to be patient, and also talking about the sort of exhilaration and pride that people felt. And of course, Shireen ended her video by saying we should draw on the 5th Pan-African Congress and refuse to wait and instead be organized and to try to push for a different reality. And that is the best way to honor their struggle today. So the video has raised so many points, including about education and erasure. So there's so many things to unpack. Shireen, of course, is also a major instigator of the celebrations this week. So that is something that we want to absolutely acknowledge and thank her for. So next up, we have Elnor Mitha. Elnor is an artist, curator, writer, and producer with specialisms in Asian cultures. And he's also a cultural and artistic policy advisor to numerous arts organizations, including the British Council and International Biennale Foundation. So he's best known, of course, for his Asia Triennale Manchester, which has supported young and emerging Asian artists over the years. Elnor is my colleague at the Manchester School of Art, where he's a senior research fellow. And we work closely together, including through something that I set up at the Department of Art and Performance called the Common Room, which has a key strand on equality, diversity, and inclusion. but the way we frame it is that it is EDI, not at, but through art and performance. So again, the notion of creativity to catalyze conversations for change. So let's have a look at what Eleanor has to say. We recorded a conversation between myself and Eleanor. So this video will show that. Thank you.
So my name is Alnor Mitha. I'm a senior research fellow with my specialism in Asian cultures. I'm a curator, artist, writer, editor, and I have worked with numerous artists over the past 2-3 decades. I was born and brought up in Uganda, in East Africa. My grandfather migrated from India in the 30s, and like many other people, he settled there. Like his generation, he was an entrepreneur. What was interesting was that historically, the British during the 1890s invited lots of Indians to come over to East Africa, particularly Uganda and Kenya, to build the railway industry. So lots of the migrant communities were doing that. There was a labor force, and of course, some of them stayed on to continue with their work there. So as a child, I remember kind of, having my friends in a very kind of cosmopolitan sort of city, and that brought to my whole vision in terms of creative vision and established me as a person that I am now. And it was fantastic, to be kind of brought up in an environment which is so stunning. It was very beautiful, agriculturally incredible, and then the big thing happened on the 4th of August 1972. Idi Amin declared that the Asians or the Indians who've been living in Uganda have to flee. They have to leave within 90 days. And of course, that meant that had a huge impact on absolutely everybody, including my family. So that was quite a kind of, a huge crisis, and obviously a lot of the Asians, whilst numerous of them, including my family, had British passports because remember, Uganda, as many other places during that time, was a British colony. So our first port of destination was England, but it wasn't really a welcoming experience, shall I say, leaving everything behind and starting a new life, coming to England was quite a challenge. But let's not forget, in 1968, Enoch Powell did his inflammatory Rivers of Blood speech, basically saying that he did not want any immigrants to come to Britain. And what's interesting is, in a way, he was coming from a very right-wing kind of perspective, very similar to actually what's happening now. If you
completely look, the sort of hostile environment with Windrush and with the van going around trying to expel people. I mean, there's so many resonances. But it's interesting because your family had to leave Africa and only to come here to face the same sort of hostility.
I think this notion of the double diaspora is that, in a way, my grandparents went and emigrated and settled in Uganda, and then we had to flee Uganda. And growing up in England was tough, but at the same time, as I say, as a young person, I found it really quite exciting as well.
It's quite interesting to hear your story. It really opens up the idea of Africa, and it's beyond the geographical domain. It's also so much related to everything else in terms of what we're talking about in terms of equality, diversity, and inclusion.
My life was shaped because I came from Uganda. It was shaped in a way that actually is what I'm doing at the moment. So I was part of the Black Arts Alliance with Suwandi Lemsise, John Lyons, so on and so forth. Then I also formed the Black Artist Studio, the first one in Manchester, in late 80s, and that really was significant. And then having been appointed a senior research fellow with a speciality in Asian cultures, I had actually formed a company called Shisha, where I formed the Asia Triennial Manchester. And the idea of the ATM is that it's the only visual arts festival in Europe with the focus of newly commissioned work. Every 3 years, the ATM has a particular theme to it. And it's very much around the societal issues that we face, you know. So the last ATM in 2018, the theme was "Who do you think you are?" And that kind of provocation brought a challenging kind of response to current debates around migration, around identity, the intersections of communities, and how better than kind of you know, commissioning contemporary artists to respond to the theme.
It has been explicitly declared that we are ending the freedom of movement. What do you think is the potentiality for arts and culture?
We have to reinforce the kind of creativity at the forefront of everything that we do. And at Manchester School of Art, we do that in a really, really brilliant way with so many different colleagues with different specialism. I am also thinking of establishing the Center for Asian Cultures, for example, you know, where it brings cultural, social, economic impact that promotes a critical understanding of this notion of Asia. And Asia is not, you know, I mean, it's not just the geographical terms, it's actually people who also respond to Asia. So kind of coming back to Manchester, I mean, it's really interesting that Manchester is an incredibly diverse city. It has kind of an immigrant population with over 150 languages spoken here, and so many different generations have lived here. So this notion of creativity, working with so many different cultures, but also reinforcing the idea of creativity. And we have to fight this to absolutely to the full, to challenge all the barriers that we are facing now, particularly in terms of Brexit. Who knows what's going to happen once we do get out of EU, you know, but it's not good, you know. We need to try and engage with artists to make things, you know, to create things that are impactful, to create things that have a particular political, artistic stance to kind of political challenges that we're going through.
Given the sort of crises that we're having now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is also why most of our events have to go online. There's also been a crisis in mental health, crisis in democracy, environmental crisis, and so on. Do you have any thoughts with regards to a vision for the future?
I have to acknowledge the awful thing that has happened, particularly to lots of Black and South Asian people who are in the front line. In terms of the pandemic, you know, if you look at the people who died, you know, as far as NHS is concerned, it is people of color. So why is that happening? That's the first question. You know, how can we change that? You know, in terms of as we move forward. You know, pandemic has created all kinds of questions around identity again. You know, around how people are sort of being challenged in terms of frontline kind of people at the workforce, you know. So we need to readdress that balance. You know, we need to do things that somehow kind of challenge that. You know, I think in terms of post-pandemic, or whilst we are in this sort of situation, again, I think we are incredibly fortunate that we are kind of equipped with creative talent, whether it's through artists or whether it's through our own kind of creative thought and the work that we're doing. That is the way to illuminate things that are incredibly complex, that
Yeah.
can be delivered in a very beautiful way. But beautiful is not necessarily just pretty things. You know, it can be very challenging as well.
I absolutely agree with you in terms of the power of art as a kind of a soft power, if you like, to really open up spaces of ambiguity, of complexity, for these sort of conversations, and the beauty of diversity, the beauty of differences of opinion, the beauty of different viewpoints.
Moving forward, we have to acknowledge diversity and inclusion in a way that perhaps hasn't happened before, you know, particularly in terms of what happened to George Floyd, when the whole world watched him die within those moments. You know, how can we change that? You know, I think we can change that through the work that we're doing at the university, reinforcing the issues around race and racism, and getting people to understand what culture and diversity and inclusion mean. As you say quite rightly, Kai, that, you know, the act of beauty, the act of being different, the act of knowing somebody who comes from a culturally different background, you know, so actually working with people and having friends that are from the diverse cultural background will it will strengthen your whole imagination in terms of who we are as humanity, who we are as people, and how humanity can transform the kind of sentiments and emotions that all of us carry with us.
So thank you very much, Eleanor. And I do apologize for the very jumpy editing and also for looking like I'm photobombing Eleanor. So I do apologize for that. But Eleanor has raised so many points, and around higher education, around the power of art, and of course also to relate his work to the notion of beauty that we raised earlier on, which has framed the which was a statement in the Pan-African Congress in 1945. Can we show the next slide, please? Just want to take this opportunity to also acknowledge some of the artwork that we are using for the festival. So the logo that you can see for the 4-day event has been designed by students. And as you can see, it is a depiction of the African continent, but with a raised, clenched fist associated with Black Lives Matter. And the colors, of course, are that of Pan-Africanism. And the process that the logo has been created, I would like to think, is also a testament to the collaborative nature of the celebrations, because it was produced by 2 students who were strangers. It's an alumni called Zainab Beras and a first-year fine art student called Victoria Abigail Rebecca Holland. And Zainab is born in Algeria, and she's currently doing her MA at Salford. And Salford is one of the collaborative partners of the festival. On the right, you can also see an artwork, and as part of the celebrations, we have a small collection of original artworks by students and alumni of the Manchester School of Art. And this one is called Priestess, and it's by Aislinn Finnegan. And it's been inspired by Afrofuturism. And Priestess 1 features a highly adorned priestess who gathers her power and spirituality from her ancestors and linking past with future. These are the words of Aislinn. So next up, our next few speakers will be live, and we're very delighted to have Rachel Evaroa. Can we show the next slide, please? Rachel is a community engagement consultant at the Robert Kennedy Human Rights. And Rachel is passionate about creating spaces where academia, business, and the local community can come together. And Rachel specializes in working with BAME, LGBTQIA+ communities, as well as the heart to reach communities. An example of her work is something that's held tomorrow, Saturday, on the 17th of October at 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And this is a socially distanced celebration outside a pub. And this is the Old Abbey Tap House in Manchester. And there will be a celebratory drink for Len Johnson and Wilf Charles, celebrating the breaking of the colour bar at the Old Abbey, which is in Hume, in 1953. So this is very much a celebration of allyship, I think. Jeff Brown, another speaker later, will be speaking more about this, as will Rochelle, I believe. But just to provide a little bit of context, it was a fateful day in 1953 that Len Johnson, on the left, who is a black boxer, and Wilf Charles, a scaffolder, on the right, they walked into the pub and Len was refused a drink. He wanted to be served, he was refused. And Johnson and Charles protested strongly without success and left the pub. So colour bars were very common in those days in Manchester, as it were in other parts of the UK. So Len and Wilf were both active members of the Communist Party, and Len had been an observer at the 5th Pan-African Congress, and they wrote up the story for the party's paper, The Daily Worker, and went to the town hall to get support from the Lord Mayor, the city councillors, and as many others as possible. And 3 days later, they returned with a large number of supporters and a letter of protest. And Len was served. So, Rachel, would you be ready to share with us your presentation? Thank you, Rachel.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Sorry, it's my fault. I didn't send a bio in, but I actually co-founded the Old Abbey Tap House 5 years ago. And I'm just going to talk a bit about my work in the community over the last 10 years and my thoughts and feelings about it and how it impacts into racism in Manchester and how people are able to find solutions for themselves and build friendships and connections. So I've always believed in community engagement based on spaces of cohesion and figure out the practical needs of the community. My background has been in venue management and club promotions, and this gave me a really good insight into the way that racism works at a legislative level in Manchester. So one of the things I worked on about 10 years ago was a lot of Black music club nights. And I was really shocked to see that the Section 28 was used here in Manchester in a different way to how it was used in London. And the lack of Black-owned spaces, I believe, and the lack of spaces for people to come and meet each other, it really, really puts back the ability of the BAME community to organise and to have those spaces to release energy. So we set up the Old Abbey Tap House, which is a pub in the Science Park, about 5 years ago. And it's one of the last pubs left in Manchester. And it's the last building of the Greenhays estate. And so we always knew that there was a lot of memories and a lot of stories around the pub that we needed to capture. So when we opened the pub, I did a big call out to try and capture these stories and find out how people felt about the pub and how people thought. And what I realized very early on is the way that regeneration has been used almost as ethnic cleansing in the area. And Hume and Mosside have now had 4 coming on to 5 ways of regeneration. And every time that existing community there has been kind of destroyed in order for this regeneration to happen. And I really truly believe that if this regeneration happened in another country, it'd be called ethnic cleansing, because you've broken up the white Irish communities, the Black communities, and the mixed families, and pushed them out into Wythenshawe. And to this day, some of those relationships still haven't formed again. And that keeps happening to the communities here. Every time there's a couple of generations where they get to settle, they get to form their community identity, there's another wave of regeneration which pushes people out. The regeneration at the moment is because of the universities. And I'm sorry that I have to talk about this here, but one of the biggest issues in Manchester is the role of the universities and how they keep encroaching spaces. And another point that doesn't get talked about much is the drug gang war that involves some of the young Black youth in this area is to do with the middle class student drug market. And what's happened in the past few years is that the gangs have actually dissipated in Moss Side, but the young people have been emulating the roles the gangs used to play, and the student drug market has dropped. So the fight is over the decreasing student drug market. And unfortunately, the way the fight has been polarized is between the young Somalian kids and the young British Black kids. And whenever there's any discussion about this, the university seems to ignore the role and the impact that 80,000 students have on the economy and the violence that happens in Moss Side and Longside and Rusholme. Another thing I've found in my work over 10 years is the way that funding and the setting up of funding bids is set means that you pit communities against each other. So for example, the National Lottery funding bid I had to do the other day, it asks you to pick ethnic groups, and it means community work becomes very project-based onto certain targeted groups. And that's the opposite of what is needed. Going back to the person before me, we need people to meet each other. We need people to create friendships. We need people to have those spaces where they can meet their neighbors, celebrate the things they share in common with each other. And at the moment, what we have is thousands and thousands of new build flats and residents squeezed into areas where there's less and less spaces for them to meet their meet fellow people. And yeah, so sorry. So yeah, I've come to the end of my presentation. It's more just reflections of what I think are the larger structural problems with racism in Moss Side. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I think these are topics that we don't discuss enough, and the topics of universities encroaching into spaces and the need, you say, to create friendships. I think that's something that we should expand on in the debate. Next up, we have Professor Farida Viz, and Farida will be followed up by Khadija Diskin. Let me just get Farida's bio up. So Farida started her early life in Kenya and left when she was 3.5. And by the time the impact of having seen posters and portraits of Jomo Kenyatta, wherever she went, had made a lasting impression. So she first came to Manchester Metropolitan University in 1998 to do her PhD in what was then called Myriad. And she taught throughout her PhD, mainly on issues around race, racism, representation, African struggles for independence, as well as the works of Spike Lee. And she says that this feels like a long time ago now. So in 2017, she returned to MMU as a professor of digital media based in the media department. And she's also director of the Visual Social Media Lab, which brings together interdisciplinary researchers from academia and across sectors interested in better understanding social media images. So Farida continues very nicely from Rachel, actually, because we are talking about erasures and so on. So Farida, would you like to share your story?
Thank you. I'm not sure if participants necessarily want to see that large photograph of me, but thank you so much to all the organisers for inviting me and for putting this panel together. It's been really a privilege to hear everyone's input so far. So thank you very much. I think what I would like to reflect on a little bit, and this is also why I constructed my bio in this way, is I've been I started my journey at MMU 22 years ago to do a PhD, and early on in my sort of teaching, my early teaching career, I was offered the opportunity to really shape what I wanted to teach, and you know, the things that were of interest to me. And I think now that I've returned to the university recently, one of the things that I've really been struck by is these conversations around decolonizing the curriculum. And it very much feels that this is now this kind of, to-do trendy thing, and it's very important, it's very kind of on message. But when I started teaching, I was teaching on modules called Race, Nation, Representation. I was teaching, as Kai said, on the films of Spike Lee. And none of this was presented as, kind of scoring points around decolonizing anything. This was just part of what was centrally felt to be important for students to know about. I was teaching a lot of stuff around Black British history, for example. So I think reflecting on that, from an education perspective, and as, a Black member of staff, a lot has changed in those 22 years. And I don't think for the better at all. What I also want to reflect on and I want to highlight is that in 2003, academic year 2003 to 2004, so about, how many years ago is that? 17 years ago? I was invited to run a module as part of the Visual Culture MA. And this module was called the Negotiated Option. And this option gave students the opportunity to kind of combine critical theory with more practical application, and also to work with stakeholders. And originally, the idea was that I would work with the Imperial War Museum. And then when that fell through, I had to think on my feet, and I had to think very quickly, what can I do with these students now? What interesting thing can we unpack together over the course of this semester? And in the end, I decided I'm going to do it about Pan-Africanism. And this tied in very well with, my portfolio of teaching at the time. And what I decided to do was I delivered this news to the students. They were not thrilled at all to hear this, that we were going to talk about Pan-Africanism, because they had been promised that they would be working with the Imperial War Museum. So I had quite a significant uphill struggle with them to kind of get them on board. And what I did is I took them outside. I delivered this essentially bad news to them. I took them outside and I said, let's just go and have a look at this plaque. Just trust me, come outside with me. Let's go and have a look at this plaque and we'll take it from there. And we went. And what was very interesting was that none of them had ever looked at it. None of them knew that it was there. None of them knew about the event. And this immediately piqued their interest. And from then, I was able to build, and we were able, as a group, we were able to reflect on that history, what it meant to the city, what it meant to the university, the old town hall, and what it meant now to these students who had come from different parts of the world. And in particular, how for some, it really changed the course of their life, thinking about Pan-Africanism and making these connections. And I'll be talking to one of my former students, Cheryl McGowan, who's of mixed heritage like myself, in terms of how this module and sort of letting Pan-Africanism into her life has really changed the course of her life and of her career. And I'll be speaking to her tomorrow at 5. But I think what is really also very significant is the way in which this event, both from 1945 and the long legacy and the long history that it has cast over the city, and celebrating this event now in the summer, following the summer of the second wave of BLM protest, is of further significance. And I was very struck by some of the parallels and the connections that Shireen drew in terms of what's happening at a local level at the university. And so I want to kind of make a broader connection and a move forward into the present day and also into the future. And the importance of this activism at institutional level in this city And so one of the things that some of my colleagues and I have been heavily involved in the summer is essentially developing a plan for change, a roadmap for change. And we collectively wrote the Black Lives Matter, a roadmap towards a faculty free of racism and discrimination, which we delivered to the faculty Pro Vice Chancellor in the summer, in the middle of June, which was signed by over 200 staff. And it came as a real surprise, I think, that there was such such heated feeling about the urgency and the necessity to take these actions when we did. And what I think is very important and very relevant is how those actions can now be turned into lasting change. And one of the things I think that we can think about, both in terms of Pan-Africanism, but also in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, is, yes, it's shone a light on things, but what is it really changing? What is it really changing long term, and for whom? And I think within an institutional setting, this is incredibly important, because we have to really break through the more kind of PR gestures and the tokenistic gestures that institutions can engage in when it comes to these questions, when it comes to framing, framing itself as anti-racist. Where is the lasting impact? Where is the real commitment to making such changes? And again, what my colleagues and I have been involved in is the possibility of the setting up of a center at Manchester Metropolitan, a research center for the study of race and racism. And we're currently in discussion with the university about this. There will be a symposium on Monday where we will start to really map what this might look like and who would get involved in this. And we've been working on this over summer. And I think the events from the summer and the celebrations that we are now part of in terms of the Pan-African Congress, I think they are all starting to come together. And my wish is that these celebrations shine a light on the history, the incredibly important history of the Congress in Manchester and for our city, but also embraces the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement, the demands of the citizens of Manchester, of the staff and the students of this university, and embraces a possibility where genuine change can be enacted. And I think that the timing of this event and the discussions around the center are coming together in a really, really powerful way. And I feel hopeful. I feel hopeful that something can genuinely change. But I always feel that I'm hopeful with a note of caution. And so I think my wish for us to think about as a panel in terms of the Pan-African Congress and its lasting legacies is, how can we continue to make those legacies relevant to the present day? And how can we also very much do that as a university community? And I was very, very impressed by the interview that Khadija conducted this morning with Hirsch, which was incredibly powerful and just amazing. And I was really struck by something Afua said in terms of no longer playing by their narrative and no longer fitting in to a dominant narrative and creating your own path. And I think that's incredibly relevant for the legacy of the Pan-African Congress, but I think this is also exceptionally relevant for the ongoing legacy of the current moment in terms of BLM. So this is something that I would like us to hold on to and really think about. How can we play outside of the dominant narratives and carve a space for ourselves? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farida. And I think that's a really powerful question. And that ties in with not only what Shireen was saying earlier on, but also what Rachel has just raised about universities encroaching into spaces. But maybe there is a meeting point somewhere. And maybe this is something that we could explore in the discussion. But we want to also now introduce Khadija Diskin, who was speaking this morning with Shireen, with Afua Hirsch. So Khadija is a PhD student, and with Farida, she's race co-chair. And Khadija, would you like to share what, would you like to step in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So just thinking about the events that have taken place so far in relation to PACAT 75, as a young person, as a student, I've been really sort of reinvigorated by the speakers we've had, really reinvigorated by the team we've had and all the work that they're doing. For me, in terms of kind of focusing back on sort of Pan-Africanism and how it relates to kind of African self-agency and self-determination in the current context, I think with everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter and with COVID, we're at a really unique juncture in how we conceive and how we, you know, really imagine what Africanness means, both conceptually and both in practice. For me, this last few months has really seen me engage in, I believe, a far more meaningful way than ever before in what I would call, you know, really radical Black thinking, and radical in the liberatory sense. I've had the absolute pleasure during this kind of period of COVID to interact with African feminists who are currently in Africa, who are in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and we've all kind of created this supportive network for which we're learning from each other. I think so often in conversations about African development, people in the diaspora, especially in the West, people in the USA and America, in America and the UK, can often have a really paternalistic approach to looking at continental Africa, right? We assume that because we've had education abroad, because we've had what we conceive of as better quality education, that we can go on there and tell people how to liberate themselves, you know, tell them what to do. And I found that there are so many activists on the ground. There are so many people who are currently doing the work of teaching and liberating on the ground. And the assumption that me outside has some sort of proprietary knowledge to liberation by virtue of the books that I read and by virtue of the university that I'm going to is so counter to what these people are doing. I think when we look currently at Nigeria, for example, and with the End SARS movement, we're seeing young people come out and mobilizing in ways that we never thought possible. I think all of this is tied into exactly what we saw happening when we witnessed the death of George Floyd and what we saw you know, young Black people in America doing. That energy that young Black people are currently having is something that I believe I've never seen before, or has actually been inspired, or something that if you look at the roots of Pan-Africanism, that's where you saw that kind of same energy. And I think for me, it just opens up a whole new world of what, you know, African development, what Blackness means globally, you know, what Blackness can mean. And for me, I've really just had to sit and imagine a new Black future in a way that I never thought. I thought, you know, growing up, the only way to truly find liberation was to very much tone down Blackness and assimilate to kind of the dominant ideologies of whiteness. And like Efwa said, and like Farida reiterated just there, we have to push against hegemony. We have to push against the dominant narratives. We have to be accepting and unapologetic of what Blackness means, of what Africanness means. This means that in our conversations about what we think development is, that we need to shift from this thinking and from this measure of Africanness and African development on Western terms. So often we compare, you know, African nations, which are only, in the case of Ghana, just 60-something years old, to nations like Britain, which are 100 years old and which are, you know, in their fabric, have been and part of this colonial exploitation of Africa. Ghana has not had the resources or the access to the resources that the UK has. Ghana has not taken part in the exploitation, in slavery, in the ways in which the UK has. But we're measuring countries like Ghana and countries like Nigeria, countries like Kenya, with the same yardstick that we're measuring the UK. And what that does is it creates this sense of absolute insecurity in our African identities, because we don't have the resources the UK does, you know. And we find that now in development conversations, African leaders discuss about new buildings that they're having as a marker of progress because they're so obsessed with this kind of European and Western imagery. I would argue that it's now more crucial than ever, you know, seeing how completely just broken down Western capitalism was when COVID happened, seeing industries fall, seeing big kind of conglomerates kind of be brought to their knees. We need to really imagine a new world. We need to imagine a new world. And I think young Black people, young people in Africa who are innovating, who are figuring out new ways to be, are going to be the leaders of that movement. They're really going to be who we get this new imagination of our world from. And this world is a world that I hope will be constructed completely as the antithesis of the kind of racial capitalist structures in which we currently are existing in. I imagine just a really kind of almost utopian-esque future for us. And I think that can only happen if, like Evaroa said, we reject Western hegemony, if we reject the dominant narratives, and we really carve out new futures for ourselves, using our own imagination, using new innovative technologies, using indigenous technologies, for example. So that's how I would categorize, and that's what I would have to add to this conversation.
No, thank you so much, Khadija. That's a lot of very powerful provocations, and I really like what you're saying about how we can push against the Western dominant narrative and to create a kind of a utopianist possibility and using indigenous technologies. Next up, we have Jeff Brown, but I want to introduce Jeff, but I'm also mindful of the time. So we have about half an hour left. And because of what Rachel has opened up and also what Farida and Khadija are talking about, I'm just wondering, maybe it would be a nice moment now to have all the panelists joining together to have a discussion. Would that work? So if we could, if the panelists could switch on our videos, and I will introduce Jeff while we're doing that. Let me see. Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
Hi. So this is Jeff Brown. I'll just introduce Jeff briefly, and then my aim is to maybe open up the conversation and also to hear Jeff's response. So Jeff is a historian, and his CV is just astounding. So he's been active in the community for a very long time. So he's active in the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. He's a member of the Revolutionary Socialist Students Federation in the late 1960s and the International Socialism member from 1971. So he has quite a few books, including a recent one on not just Peterloo, the anti-apartheid march to the Springbok match at Old Trafford. And I thought Jeff would be quite a nice kind of bridge to kind of maybe try to open up the conversations, also because Jeff works closely with Shireen. So you're kind of anchored between higher education, universities, and also with the communities.
Yes, well, I mean, it's fantastic being here. And I just want to try and pull out some of the things that have inspired me most from the contributions. It's not as if there is any scope here for a real argument. I think our common ground is what we need to work on. But I do think it's worth pointing out some of the historic links. I think that the reality is that we have not taken our history as seriously as we should have done. Shireen and Farida, Khadija, everybody has mentioned the way in which there was this blue plaque that stood in on the town hall. It was actually Kath Locke, the woman who was worked in the restaurant, the Cosmopolitan, in 1945, and got to know Kenyatta and McConnell as a teenager, that actually fought after it was on the 40th anniversary in 1985 for that plaque to go up. This was not something that the city had recognized. Here we have a city that has always been a migrant city. Today it's a migrant city. A quarter of the population of the city of Manchester were born outside the United Kingdom. I mean, it continues to be a fantastic success because of its diversity. And I just think it's important to remember, Elnor was talking about, the importance of the artistic contribution made by the migrant communities in the city. Shireen mentioned the mural that was put up by a German Jewish refugee, painted by a German Jew, paid for by McConnell in the Cosmopolitan Yet actually there is not any record beyond a single poor quality photograph of that mural. That has not been treated with the kind of care that really it should have been in order to keep some kind of proper recognition of that piece of our history. And I just think that, to pick up on Khadija's point, the whole point about the Pan-African Congress was a group of people who actually decided to take history into their own hands. There's no question in my mind, the Pan-African Congress is the most important event that happened in Manchester in the 20th century. Everybody's heard of Peterloo. We had the most immense celebrations, and correctly so, of the 1819 demonstration and the massacre that followed. There is now a fine, monument to that. Nothing of that. We have got a splendid new artwork in the newly renovated building, but the reality is we've still got a long way to go to really bring in that history. And I want to finish on one point. People have mentioned that there is a fine mural of George Floyd in Stevenson Square, which is there for people to remind people. What people perhaps don't know is that the person who probably plays alongside McConnell the most important role in organizing the Pan-African Congress and making it possible in a city where the color bar is a reality and accommodating 100 visitors is a real challenge. Actually, the person who builds the Pan-African Federation in Manchester, Dr. Peter Milliard, who himself, was, I could talk at length about it. He comes to Manchester in the early 1930s when Mussolini's Italian fascist invasion of Ethiopia, then Abyssinia, takes place. He goes and does street meetings in Stevenson Square within a few yards of where the George Floyd mural is, protesting against that invasion. That is something which, shows enormous courage in 1935. That is how he actually built what becomes the Pan-African Federation in Manchester, what actually enables, that kind of base alongside, of course, this fantastic space. And people have been talking about space and the importance of creating space. McConnell's boldness, his vision of being how it's possible to get people to actually come together and celebrate that blackness, is through not just one but 4 restaurants, of which the Cosmopolitan is the biggest and best known. But the fact is that this is something which he understands is the basis. You can't even begin to actually do this sort of work unless you've got that space. And McConnell has got this amazing creativity in being able to make that all happen. And I'll finish at that point. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's really, I think Ola might have something to share. Ola, did you want to say something? I'm just wondering if the panelists could join us now, and then we could respond to the points because there were quite a few points that resonated across.
No, I think so. I think it's been a very interesting set of talks. I think that the points that have been made have been well made, and it is worrying about what the selective memory of places are in terms of what's current now, what was current 20 years ago. I mean, Farida paints a very different picture of MMU as it was presumably 20 years ago to what it is now. And the resonances, obviously, in terms of, because I had done a bit of reading about particularly Dr. Peter Milliard, and I think, again, probably alerting you to the talk this evening by Professor Kwame Appiah, son of Joe Appiah. He does actually talk about these links and what his father thought in those days, and how that there was a very different viewpoint in Manchester then than now. But even then, if we think about the Pan-African Congress itself, the way it was reported was very, very muted. So again, there is something about indeed ploughing our own path, which again is what they had done back then. But I think they had very much been at the forefront, because a lot of them has come from what had been America in those days, which was actually much worse than here in terms of the colour bar and so on. But again, Manchester did seem to be this place that was, in the scheme of things, a place where these activities, the actual Congress could be held. But it's certainly by not just it being Manchester, it's these characters, McConnell, Milliard, and the students from across the world who were able to actually make Manchester a place that could actually welcome and hold this very significant conference.
And it's interesting that as we think about what an alternative future could look like, something that actively rejects the dominant mode of doing things. Farida talks about this new center. Elna also talked about a center. So what could such a center look like, and what does it do? How does it do things that differs from dominant practices? Because Rachel is back here. So, and Rachel raised some very powerful points that we don't talk about enough, about how universities work with communities or don't work with communities. On our phone call, when we had a little chat before this session, we were sharing about practices or how there could be better practices, better ways of doing things. And is there an opportunity here to create this, not third way, because it's never binary, but this other way that matches up with what Khadija you're saying in terms of this kind of new imaginary, this new kind of you even used the word utopianist. So so is there something in there that this something else, this other model in terms of this center? I mean, Khadija, what are your thoughts? And Rachel, very much like to hear you as well.
I've sort of just been alongside Farida, just kind of watching her really take this thing that was an idea, and she's done this amazing job of putting it together and creating what for me is part of this kind of new Black imaginary in what could be a center that, you know, from what Farida talks about, you know, when she talks about the center, it's not just a space of just, you know, academic intellectualizing. It's truly a space that embodies, you know, the culture of what Manchester is. And I think it's really important now when we talk about things like decolonizing. I'm reminded of Linda T. Smith, who mentions that, you know, decolonizing is not just a descriptor, it's an action, right? And for me, decolonizing is about giving back space. If we look back at Fanon, what decolonizing is, it's about giving land back, because that's what colonization was. So for me, a university that exists in this metropolis, a university that exists and is taking up space from some of the most marginalized people in its community, a university that is creating tensions, is not a university that can ever be truly decolonial. It doesn't matter how many Black people you add to the curriculum, that university is a colonial institution. To embody what decolonization is, this university needs to give back space. So what Rachel said really, really, you know, resounded with me, because, you know, the university currently, for example, for MMU is situated in Hulme, which is a huge history of Blackness. And we find that the community is seldom invited into that building. In fact, we've heard of, you know, Black academics, Black members of staff being profiled when standing at that building. And that to me is just a reiteration of the fact that this building that exists does not seek to decolonize. This building is colonial in its complete formation. So the creation of a center that welcomes back the community, a center that says this space is yours and we are giving it back to you, right? We're effectively doing reparations to the community that is being served here. And that for me is part of that imagination, right? That's for me is part of what being a decolonial scholar is, part of what decolonizing is, and part of what decolonizing, you know, higher education is saying to communities, we are sorry for the ways in which we've disturbed your activity and we want to give it back to you.
If I could add to that, I think, I mean, completely agree with what Khadija is saying, but I think it's not just about space. Space is really, really important. It's also about the spaces that are created for staff and students who are part of the university. And these are not necessarily physical spaces. These are spaces to be heard. These are spaces to assert. These are spaces not to be put down. These are spaces not to be challenged. These are spaces not to be ridiculed. These are spaces not to be abused. And these are incredibly, incredibly important. And these spaces hardly exist now. And so one of the things that has been, for me personally, very powerful this last summer in sort of, you know, working with colleagues on this is how I think tired Black staff and students are about holding space. That's what we do all the time. We have to hold space for others. We have to make sure that others are okay. And it's always at the expense of yourself. And so to think about what could a space be where you don't have to do that, where you can be yourself, where you don't have to worry about being labeled immediately as the angry Black woman, that to me is a space of utopia. And that goes hand in hand with thinking about university structures. That goes hand in hand with thinking about ways of being a leader. That goes hand in hand with thinking about what does leadership look like for this actually to deliver for the most people. And universities are not thinking about these things, really. Universities are not designed with those structures in mind. Universities are very hierarchical. So from management structures to communication structures, everything is very, very top down. That is not going to work for a center that at its core is anti-racist, right? So taking those dominant, crushing structures into this center is not an option. But that is a challenge, and to really think through the new leadership models and to really try to explain why it is important not to have a single director with a co-director, why all of these structures reinforce, dominant kind of ways of thinking and Western hegemonies. All of that is a huge uphill battle, but that I think is where we have a real opportunity to open up a space for possibility to do these things and to show what alternative leadership could look like, what genuine collaboration could look like, what it means to bring PhD students really at the center of this right from the beginning. And that is what we're trying to do. But I think at the same time that there is enthusiasm, there is perceived threat in what this is and what this could mean. Because, what if this spreads? What if this, what if this mode of thinking and doing escapes the center? But I think this is the challenge. And I think for those of us who are involved in this is what we believe in a way. And, it cannot be anything less.
Absolutely. Rachel, what are your thoughts? How did you feel about that? All these new spaces, safer spaces.
I totally agree with everything everyone said. The university, so I'm part of the Human Community Forum, and the university's tried to get more students involved, and they just have a lack of oversight. So last year they tried to get a load of students to volunteer on the Hume Christmas Festival, but then they wanted the community to pay the insurance bill, which was about £2,000, when the whole Christmas festival was going to cost £2,000. And the other bit is about invisible boundaries within the university. I think people don't understand that the way the universities are designed, it's a very stagnant space, and it's a space that makes certain people feel calm, but other people feel excluded from it. And I think Kadia touched on that as well, about how people feel excluded from those space. And then there's also the point that culturally, what some people might view as chaotic is actually part of the fabric of that community. So I love Hume High Street, which is all Black-owned businesses, and it's got this feeling of energy, but other people can look at that area and say, this needs regeneration, this needs that, and it's changing perception about what people want out of their communities. And yeah, and I know that a few years ago there was a big issue with a lot of asylum seeker men coming to this country and standing in the street and gathering, because in African communities and in Middle Eastern communities, that's where you engage, that's where you meet your neighbours on the street. Whereas in England, we have this perception that if you're gathering outside in a group, it's dangerous. So yeah.
No, thank you so much. I want to bring Beresford back in, but I also want us to think about this question again, the post-pandemic future, the fact that the whole festival is now shifted online. As we talk about spaces, and Khadija, you said it's not, Farida, you said it's not just physical spaces, and we are talking about invisible boundaries and so on. And obviously, online spaces aren't aren't free, there are other kinds of boundaries and so on. But is there something in there also in this projection of this sort of decentralized other spaces? So that's one. And I also want to take on the point raised by Rachel about Rachel and also Farida about other models of leadership. And I've been working with Ola in the past few months. And in fact, I met Farida, Ola, and Khadija in one of these spaces in early June, where we were all frightened. We didn't even know if we were allowed to talk about race. Why we didn't even know.
Mainly angry, not so much frightened, mainly angry.
Also very, very angry. I was the person who asked the question this morning to Afua about being an angry woman. But I also wanted to talk about how working with Ola in the past few months and on this festival, I've really seen what an alternative model of leadership looks like. So Ola very much take the back seat. She is the opposite of an alpha male. She's the opposite of dominant models. It's completely collaborative. The fact that Beresford is now our conspirator, and also obviously Shireen, as we mentioned. So it's a very, very diversified model of leadership, and also very feminist. She's putting well-being, care at the forefront, stubbornly. And it's a very quiet model of leadership. So I'm just wondering if there's something in some of these points I've raised, and maybe Beresford could come in and also maybe Jeff and also Ola, obviously. Beresford, have you got any responses?
Yeah, for me, I mean, I don't like boxes. I tend to be very strategic. Well, I don't think I'm strategic in my thinking. So for me, it isn't a case of being dominant or being not dominant. It's a case of what is most effective towards achieving one's goal. And for me, our goal is basically defeating race inequality and advancing race equality. So it doesn't really matter for me what it takes. What all that matters is how we go about it. And I think it's most important that we basically, as Black people, and I use the word Black in terms in the widest term here, as in anybody who's not white, basically, to say we have a common enemy. Our common enemy is racial inequality / white privilege and so on and so forth. So I don't really care who I work with, as long as we all combine and work together and defeat that common enemy first. Then after we defeated that common enemy, then we can go away and fragment ourselves into various fragmented groups and say, oh, I'm brown and I am all the other different ethnicities that we might want to place ourselves in. So for me, the primary thing is defeating race inequality, and everything is devoted towards that at all cost.
No, thank you so much, Beresford. And Beresford is, of course, the co-chair of the BAME network at the University of Manchester. So we have quite a few co-chairs. And that thing about co-chairing as well, the co-leadership model that Farida you're doing, that's also really interesting. We have 10, 14 minutes left. I'm wondering if this would be an appropriate time to maybe hear from the audiences. If there are questions that have been forwarded. And maybe also
there is a question here.
Yeah.
Someone commenting, after 30 years, I am so sick and tired. Will change come?
I'm really hopeful. I've got to say, and I wasn't hopeful before, but I'm more hopeful now than I think I've ever been. And I am this way because of the ways in which young people are really just entering the movement. The ways in which they can articulate themselves is something that I don't think I've ever seen before. And it's not just, previously they, you know, Pan-Africanism, previously racial justice, used to be quite, you know, small groups working towards these things, small groups of activists. And now the language that they have, now the movements of young people, we saw something like 10,000 young people in Manchester protesting for Black Lives Matter. It's become something that has just transformed. I remember when the first Black Lives Matter protest happened, following the Baltimore riots and the Missouri riots, and I hosted a Black Lives Matter thing at my university, and there were about 15 of us, right? There were about 15 of us with placards trying to get people involved. And there was a sense of disinterest. And now to see that morph into thousands of people across the country, in places like Cornwall, they were having protests. In places like, you know, Edinburgh, they were having protests. It's really fascinating to see. And when you talk to young people, which is what I do often, the kind of energy that they have, you know, they are ready, and they, you know, they are unwavering in their demands. You know, they're saying, this is what we want, and we want it now. And you either make it happen or we will do it ourselves. And that is something that I think is just, you know, we can look at, and we should be inspired by. And I think it's the kind of role of the older generation to guide young people, because we have the energy, but we don't always have the expertise. We don't always know what we're coming up against. There's so many young people who don't have the experience of, you know, facing really, really violent racial injustice, and educating them and letting them know, and teaching them and guiding them through, I think it's gonna really transform the world.
That's a great point about young people. As a young person yourself, Khadija, I mean, this is quite an intergenerational panel.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
Well? Very briefly. One thing in terms of, you know, Khadija being, you know, hopeful, I also feel more hopeful than I think I have felt for a long time. And I think one of the things that I suppose makes me feel more hopeful that things are changing at a more fundamental level coincides with the specificities of our current working life. And the fact that most of us are now working online most of the time. And I think the fact that most of us spend half of our day on Zoom has really opened up the possibilities to organize. And I think that should not be, you know, taken out of the equation. That is actually hugely significant. So the meetings that were held over the summer around Black Lives Matter at the university, where every week over 100 people would come together and talk and see each other and share and, you know, really build solidarity and movement, I think is only possible because we had these online platforms, and we have these online platforms. I do not think that every single week in a physical space, 100 people would show up and make this happen. And so I think what is starting to change is people are starting to think and rethink these hierarchies and are breaking them down, because now for the last 6 months, we have kind of, there is something new building because of the ways in which we are able to organize. And I think that is very, very interesting. And I think if we return to the, you know, all return to campus in physical, you know, physical sense in a month, then something will have profoundly and fundamentally changed. We are no longer used to the normal, you know, past way of having meetings. And I think that is something to really, really build on, because that is part of what is, you know, is really going to lead to lasting change.
No, that's extremely interesting. In that we're seeing a kind of opening up of spaces. Jeff, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to come in. I mean, I feel very hopeful, and I absolutely agree with Farida's point about how Zoom has opened up possibilities, and in particular, I mean, for me, a simple point about the internationalism now that is now just the default. You know, you just have no real thought about somebody from different continents coming and taking part. The only problems you have is how many time zones can you accommodate at once. So that's a fantastic positive. But in terms of the sort of the point of Khadija's about how, you know, we started small. I mean, we think back to 1945, you know, this ambition that you're going to hold a conference declaring the independence of a continent. Yeah, there's going to be 100 of you or something. You're going to, now, I mean, come on, that's an inspiring thought that if if they could do it, so can we. I think it's also worth pointing out that actually the conference is itself inspired by mass movements. I mean, the most important single one probably is the general strike of Nigeria in May 1945, which is the first great strike in what is Britain's biggest African colony. And it basically is the beginning of the end of anybody can see that this is the beginning of the end of colonialism in Nigeria. Yeah, in Manchester, they hold a meeting, they raise over £100 from people who basically haven't got any money at all, but it's one of the key ways in which they pull the African community and the African diaspora of Manchester together, and then put forward them to the idea that, hey, we can host the conference. I mean, everybody had assumed the conference was going to be, well, actually, originally it was going to be Paris, and then it was going to be London. And then actually, who comes through? It's this group of people who really got their act together on the ground, and that's where we're at now, I think.
Absolutely. There are a few questions coming in. I just want to try to read that, but I also want to just point out and remind us maybe, Shireen, in her quote, in her video, she talked about how we shouldn't be patient. We shouldn't have to wait. And so we're talking about a kind of momentum being built up and new possibilities opened up because of these online spaces. So let's keep that in our minds. And I'm going to read the couple of questions that have come in. So this one is from Rudy Rachel. It says, what do you think about the racism that takes place in the queer community in Manchester, in particular the turning away of Black males from gay clubs on the grounds that they are, quote, trouble? I'll just read the next question. So please think about who wants to take up the first one. Fiona, okay. Yeah, Fiona Hackney says, really interesting. I think this is a comment rather than a question. Really interesting discussion, particularly around spaces for reimagining our lives and how they might be. So rethinking hierarchies, and that's so important for all of us and students. But how can we do this in what feels like an increasingly structured way of living, working due to the pandemic? By structured, I also mean limited. And I think Rachel also typed in a point as Kai Singh, but that's Rachel. I think she's impersonating me. So maybe Rachel, with your permission, maybe I'll read out what you said so that the panelists could maybe respond. So Rachel says, yes, for sure, they're amazing. She's okay, I think majority of queer LGBT people are not happy to be represented by Canal Street, and it actually puts gay rights back another 20 years. So this is back to the notion of kind of contested areas. Again, it comes down to putting people into neat categories when it is obvious no one really sits into them. Yeah, go on, Khadija.
So being like a member of the queer community and working quite closely and attending sort of Rainbow Noir over the last few years, I think, we can't just, state this as an issue in relation to Canal Street. It's an issue, all around when it comes to the queer community. The exclusion of Black people from queer spaces has historically been something that we've seen all the time. What we can do, though, and what I'm seeing more of, is young queer Black people creating and finding spaces for themselves. For example, places like Black Angel, places like Rainbow Noir, whereby, for many of us, our identities are, sometimes they feel oppositional, sometimes they're complex, sometimes they're nuanced. And what's the most important for us is to find spaces that are safe. For me, as a queer Black woman, if I enter a club or a space and they don't want me there, I don't want to be there, because that is no longer a space where I'm safe. That is no longer a space where any Black person should feel safe. And it's sad, because that shouldn't be the case, but we see things like that happening everywhere. And we're seeing currently, the queer community also having a real reckoning and having their own sort of Black Lives Matter movement, whereby queer trans people are speaking up, they're speaking out. We're forming and building solidarities across the kind of scope of who and what we are. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because, and I know, this never works, because I think we had a session where members of Rainbow Noir were actually meant to sit with the council and talk about Canal Street and talk about how we can improve kind of Black queer representation. And so many of us found that to be a difficult conversation to have. We didn't find that conversation to be a safe conversation, just because of the history, just because of what we know of that space as not being inclusive of us. But what's happened since Black Lives Matter has happened, people like Tanya Compass have raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for Black queer people, for queer people of color. And now, you know, with those resources, we are able to create spaces for queer people specifically. So I would say just, you know, I'm still hopeful. I'm still critical, and, you know, any space that doesn't want Black bodies is not a space that is safe, and it's not a space that I want to ever be in. So that's how I'd look at the issues about those clubs in Canal Street.
I think
Rachel, go ahead.
So one big issue, again, it comes back to lack of spaces, but Canal Street has been sold off to a Malaysian investor, and they've sold the plans to Malaysian investors, and they've been selling it off plan around as Portland Village without any mention of the LGBTQ community there. And in Malaysia, it's still legal to be gay. So how can our city leaders sell off our prime LGBT area, even if we contest it, to a government that doesn't believe in gay rights? So it is so structural, and it comes down to redevelopment and lack of spaces again.
No, absolutely. We are running out of time, but this is not the end of the discussion. I think what we've done is to really open up space. This is an example of those spaces that we're opening up. Yay. Well, so there aren't any conclusions, unless maybe Ola, do you have a big rousing final thing to say? Or Beresford?
I guess the thing is, I think what comes through is that we have to be strategic, which is exactly what the organizers were back in 1945. And yes, I guess anecdotally, I am old enough to know when my mother had to book a phone call to Lagos in the 60s. I mean, that was Lagos, a major metropolitan city. Whereas now my same mother is 92 and she can use a mobile phone and speak to her relatives in Lagos. So this closeness in terms of space is also something that we should never underestimate. So and I think, as Jeff says, what a challenge it would have been in 1945, end of the Second World War, major movements, and these guys, they were mainly guys, although there was Amy Garvey and there was somebody from two people from the West Indies, two women. You know, we're a much more cosmopolitan crowd now, and this is the moment. I think, you know, I'm incredibly humbled that, you know, what was an idea, and it was a collaborative idea. Beresford was at that table, as was Shireen, as was Marie Malloy, and amongst us, I think we've managed to pool, I think, what is a space to really develop whatever it is we next do. And the past has shown that it is possible. And obviously, with an African saying, you cannot know your future unless you know your past. So this is absolutely critical to, I think, not just those who have an interest in African history, but I think certainly to Manchester as a city. This is a critical moment to celebrate, and that we should really build on. So
are we talking about the 76th anniversary
over
celebrations? No, younger people. Khadija, we're tired. Well, can we have the final slide? So tonight at 7:30 p.m., please join us in a keynote lecture by Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah, and of course his father Joe Appiah attended the 5th Pan-African Congress. So he will, Kwame Anthony Appiah will be live from Princeton, and Ola will be chairing the session. And
so queue up your questions now.
yeah, there's a queue. But and thank you so much, everyone, for another lively conversation. After attending your session this morning, Khadija, I was saying, yeah, we need this every single morning. And now, and now we're like, yeah, we need this every single afternoon as well. And then we have 7:30. Oh gosh. But yeah, so 7:30 p.m. will be another example of those kind of spaces, those kind of nice, beautiful, productive, beautiful spaces. So thank you so much, everybody. So let this be the start of more conversations to come. Thank you so much to all the panelists, Jeff, Khadija, Farida, Ola, Beresford, Rachel. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for
big thank you to Kai for holding it. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Take care.
Bye. See you soon.